So with a franchise that has been around for as long as Resident Evil, you are bound to see changes made with each entry of the series. And with changes comes features and mechanics that are sometimes left behind only to never be seen from again. From small details like the main menu screen to major gameplay mechanics, Resident Evil continues to change its identity with each passing day. And while a lot of the changes and removed features in future entries are usually for the better, every now and then Capcom does remove something that just hits differently for some of us older fans of the franchise. Sure, some of these features could be viewed as outdated to newer players, but there are certain fans out there that appreciated these things, and for a lot of us, these things form the cornerstone of the Resident Evil franchise. So in this episode of Nerdspace Games, I want to dive back into the history of Resident Evil as I look at some of the dead and forgotten features and mechanics of the franchise that I think should one day see the light of day again. I don't expect to see all of these mechanics featured in the next mainline Resident Evil game, but it would be pretty cool at the very least to see them appear in spin-off games at some point. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and these are 10 dead and forgotten Resident Evil features that I think should make a comeback in a future game. Number 10, Inventory Box. During the classic age of Resident Evil, inventory management was more important than ever, since you couldn't just drop items on the ground like you could in RE0 or discard useless resources like you could in later games. Managing your inventory was almost as important as preserving your ammo and healing items. Thankfully, there was a magic inventory box in each of these games that allowed you to store any items you didn't need immediately that connected to other boxes scattered throughout the game. It might seem like a relatively simple mechanic, but for the longest time it was a staple of the franchise. In fact, the one time that a classic styled Resident Evil game didn't have an inventory box was Resident Evil 0, and it faced major backlash from the community. Unfortunately, the inventory box was removed completely during the action trilogy, that being RE4 through RE6, and while it did make its return in Resident Evil 7, it was nowhere to be seen from again in Resident Evil Village. I know, some people do love managing that giant suitcase that Leon carries around in RE4, but come on, the inventory box was an iconic set piece in the original RE games, and it would be a damn shame if they didn't make their grand return at some point in a future game. Number 9, alternate costumes that you don't have to pay for. While modern Resident Evil games do feature alternate costumes, the problem is that most of them are usually in the form of paid DLC. Unfortunately, I don't think that will be changing anytime soon, as the gaming industry has changed a lot since the 90s, as big companies usually make a ton of money on selling cosmetics in each of their games. And even when there are alternate costumes available in the store or they are unlockable in modern RE titles, they are usually pretty underwhelming. Taking a look at older Resident Evil games, we used to get a ton of unlockable costumes that we would just unlock just for beating the game or completing certain challenges. Let's use RE3 Nemesis and RE3 Remake to compare a new game to an older game. In the remake, Jill Valentine had a total of 2 unlockable costumes. Classic RE3 Jill, which honestly Capcom didn't do that right anyways, and RE1 Jill Valentine. Then when you take a look at RE3 Nemesis, you have a total of 7 different costumes for Jill Valentine, one of which includes a Dino Crisis Easter egg. So something that I would love to see for future Resident Evil entries are alternate costumes for the playable characters, and good ones at that. Obviously Village we saw no costumes because, it kind of makes sense, first person mode, but whatever. But even RE4 Remake featured very limited costumes, and most of them were kind of underwhelming in my opinion. So here's hoping that Capcom takes a page out of their own book and brings back the amount of unlockable costumes that they used to feature in their older games. Number 8, Menu Voice.
Resident Evil. Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil. Resident Evil 0.
Okay, so this seems like a pretty basic one to include on this list, but considering that I grew up playing the classic Resident Evil games, it kills me that we don't hear that iconic voice saying Resident Evil in the newer entries of the series. I think the last mainline game to use this iconic voice was Revelations 2, I believe, unless you count remakes, in which case RE2 Remake Deluxe Edition featured the voice as well. I know it's such a small feature in previous Resident Evil games, but the sound of that voice saying Resident Evil stuck with me all of these years later in the same way that the PlayStation 1 startup clip did. I remember the chills I used to get when I started up RE2, and it went from that PlayStation startup video to the main menu voice of Resident Evil.
Resident Evil 2.
Seriously, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. Capcom, please bring this back for all future Resident Evil games. It's such a nostalgic thing, but I'm all for it. And for those people that don't want it, maybe give them an option to turn it off if they really want to, but I really don't understand why you wouldn't want this. Number 7, branching narratives. Here's a feature that hasn't really been used much in the Resident Evil franchise, but something that I really used to appreciate in the games that did feature it. The two games that stick out to me the most in terms of their branching narratives are Resident Evil and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. The first game of the series allowed the players to explore the Spencer Mansion, in which they could visit certain locations at different points throughout the story. By exploring specific areas before others, the players would get different cutscenes. For example, in the original Nightmare, Chris could find Rebecca Chambers for the first time in the West Wing safe room or next to Richard Aiken, depending on which location they visit first. Jill's campaign features more branching narratives, mainly thanks to Barry Burton. Based on when Barry helps Jill, where they meet up, and decisions made by the player, different scenes will play out between Barry and Jill. Most notably, there's 2 important decisions that could be made throughout Jill's playthrough in which Barry will die depending on the choices made during these moments. Obviously though, the game that completely blew us away with its branching narratives was Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. This game built an entire mechanic around this feature called life selection. Throughout the story, the screen will flash and the players will need to make a difficult choice. These choices will influence which path you will take, allowing the player to explore different routes with each playthrough. Some of these choices can even influence different endings, different cutscenes, and even additional boss fights. While I highly doubt we'll ever match the levels of RE3 Nemesis in terms of their branching narratives, my hope is that we'll at least get to the point where the original Resident Evil game was at. RE3 Nemesis was really the last game that fully explored branching narratives, with Resident Evil 7 and Revelations 2 being the mainline games that came closest to it since they both feature multiple endings, but both endings were unlocked in both games by a single choice made by the player. Number 6, Zombies. For the longest time, zombies dominated the Resident Evil universe. Since that first zombie turned its head to face us after feeding on our fallen comrade in the original Nightmare, to watching Leon or Claire put down Marvin after he changed right before our very eyes. There was a time where Resident Evil and zombies used to go hand in hand with each other. You really couldn't have one without the other. Unfortunately, with Capcom taking the franchise in a different direction to focus more on action horror, Resident Evil sadly decided to leave the zombies behind and bring us POWs that were faster and more intelligent than the slow movie walkers. Still, there was something terrifying and special about zombies and Resident Evil. Whether it was their horrifying moaning or the fact that they were deteriorating right before our very eyes. I just always felt that zombies brought a more terrifying element to Resident Evil games compared to infected soldiers with guns and other weapons. And before you start to say, but Ruben, zombies are simplistic and don't add any real challenge to the gameplay of modern games. Well then, I will point you towards Resident Evil 2 Remake. Despite zombies moving relatively slow, RE2 Remake proved that by making zombies more aggressive in narrow hallways and small rooms, that they could actually easily be more challenging to face than some of the normal enemies you see in later Resident Evil entries. Especially if you find yourself getting overwhelmed when a handful of them begin to surround you. So I really don't think that's really a good excuse. Zombies can be challenging if done the right way. Sure, it'll mean that the game in which they appeared in will need to feature small contained areas or buildings to raise their threat level, but honestly, I've always found these type of areas in horror games work better for atmospheric horror anyway, so bring it on. Number 5, Typewriters and Ink Ribbons. Okay, so I do need to specify what I mean here. I don't think we need to bring back actual typewriters and ink ribbons in the Resident Evil franchise, although that would be pretty cool. What I mean is that I miss the days where Resident Evil games used to challenge the player to choose wisely each time they wanted to save. For example, excluding remakes, the most recent entry to feature manual saves with limited save methods was Resident Evil 7's Madhouse mode. In that mode, players will need to find cassette tapes in order to save, meaning that the player had a limited amount of saves throughout the entire game. In comparison, Resident Evil 4 Remake features a typewriter, but no matter what difficulty you played on, you don't need to collect ink ribbons to save. Yeah, you can just save as many times as you want. I actually love the challenge of being cautious of the amount of times you can save, as it added another level of survival horror in terms of the limited resources available to you. Unfortunately, this is something that most RE games have moved away from. RE2 Remake chose to bring it back with its hardest difficulty, but games like RE3 Remake and Village shied away from limited saves completely. And sure, I get the whole argument just choosing not to save a lot during playthroughs, but it's not the same thing, guys. I like managing my resources and trying to plan out when and where I should use each ink ribbon. I would love for future games to feature this mechanic again, although I get that not every player appreciates this feature, so instead maybe do what Resident Evil 7 and RE2 Remake did and add a difficulty mode that adds this mechanic as an exclusive feature to that mode only. Number 4, fixed camera angles. Probably the most divisive topic within the Resident Evil community is the argument as to which gameplay perspective is the best in the Resident Evil franchise. Since the franchise has been reinvented multiple times, fans of the series from different generations lean towards their own personal preference in terms of which perspective they prefer. Every mainline Resident Evil game can be divided into 3 different categories: fixed camera angles, first person, and over-the-shoulder third person. Without diving into a deep discussion as to which one I personally prefer, I want to focus on the only one of these 3 perspectives that haven't been seen in over 2 decades now, that being fixed camera angles. See, taking a look at the last few Resident Evil games, the remakes featured over-the-shoulder third-person perspectives, while the 2 newest mainline entries of the series focus on first-person perspectives. And while there are rumors that Resident Evil 9 will lean towards what the remakes have been doing lately, the fact remains that fixed camera is still the only one of the 3 being left in the past. The last time we saw fixed camera angles was Resident Evil 2002 Remake and Resident Evil 0, in which both released in 2002. Outside of that, we did get an unlockable mode for the Lost in Nightmares DLC of RE5 that is allowed to be played in fixed camera angles, but yeah, it felt kind of off to say the least. Anyway, I don't really expect a future Resident Evil game to be made completely in fixed camera angles, or at least not a mainline entry. Instead, here's what I'm proposing in order to bring back this iconic feature from older RE games. 1. Give us a mode that allows us to play the newest game in fixed camera angles. I know it kind of requires a lot of work, but considering the success of the fan-made mod for Resident Evil 2 Remake that allowed the players to play that game in fixed camera angles, it's definitely possible. And not only is it possible, but there's a high demand for it. Doing it this way, it adds replayability to the game while also appeasing different fans of the series. The other, and probably the more reasonable solution though, is to make a spin-off Resident Evil game and make that game fixed camera angles. I get that Capcom doesn't really want to mess with their formula for the mainline entries, as it's been really working well for them lately. However, a spin-off game allows them to have more creative freedom and allows them to take more chances. We've seen spin-off games of the series do similar changes in gameplay mechanics before, like how the Chronicle games were on-rail shooters. So giving us a spin-off game that's fixed camera angles shouldn't be that far out of the realm of possibilities, right? Number 3, difficult puzzles. While I don't think it's required to feature puzzles in survival horror games, it's something that I've always really appreciated. The feeling of trying to solve a difficult puzzle with an eerie soundtrack playing in the background always filled me with anxiety while also helping set the mood, creating the perfect atmospheric horror setting. Unfortunately, a lot of the later entries of RE have started to move away from puzzles by doing less of them and making them less difficult. While Village featured a handful of interesting puzzles, with my favorite being the basement section of House Beneviento, most of the game lacked challenging puzzles. Resident Evil 4 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake were kind of the same way, in which they both featured some puzzles, but they were very limited in the amount of puzzles they had, and they didn't require much logic to solve. Resident Evil 7's Happy Birthday Tape and the Bedroom DLC were prime examples of what I kinda wanted from a Resident Evil game, but again, one of them was not in the main game and the other one was actually just a short section in the main game. And obviously, I could just skip over the entire action trilogy as most of those games featured very limited puzzles, most of which were not difficult in the slightest. So with that being said, it's clear that the Resident Evil franchise has chosen to move away from the focus on puzzles in their games, but I would love for Resident Evil 9 and every other entry after it to change that. Puzzles have always been a major part of my favorite survival horror games, and the recent release of Silent Hill 2 Remake showed me what modern Resident Evil games could be like if they brought puzzles back into the mix as a major part in the future of the franchise. Number 2, limited resources. One of the most important elements of true survival horror is the fact that the player is usually limited on the amount of resources that they can find in the game. From bullets to healing items or even items like ink ribbons that are used to save, all of these items are important resources to the player and each one of them are limited in survival horror games. Thus, it requires the player to think carefully each time before using any of them. Sadly, later RE games have started to lean towards action horror, which means instead of providing the player with limited resources throughout the entire game, players could find resources after killing enemies or breaking boxes. This is not really a bad thing, but it just kind of takes the franchise towards a similar path as it did a decade ago, the action trilogy. While I don't dislike the action trilogy of the franchise, it just felt less like a horror game as it became a third-person shooter, not too different from games like the Gears of War franchise. Personally, what I've always loved about the Resident Evil franchise were the survival horror elements, and the lack of limited resources in the later entries of the series kind of takes that out of my Resident Evil games. Don't get me wrong, RE4 Remake is a masterpiece, and I actually don't dislike Village, but I would like to see some sort of compromise in the next Resident Evil Mainline game. Like maybe include some of the mechanics from RE4 Remake, like the knife combat or melee options, but still feature limited resources in which the player will need to conserve resources instead of just blowing everything away in their path. Number 1, multiple scenarios.
Resident Evil.
Considering that we've only seen this feature implemented in 3 mainline entries of the franchise, obviously multiple scenarios or campaigns in the same game is something that isn't explored as much as it used to be. While the first game featured 2 campaigns and RE6 featured 4 campaigns, the best example of this feature done right was Resident Evil 2, the original game. In that version of RE2, we got to see Leon and Claire solve different puzzles and face off against different bosses throughout most of the game. And decisions made in one scenario would affect the other character's scenario of the game as well. This was a feature that I actually really loved, and it's a damn shame that it hasn't fully been explored since this game. RE6 may have featured 4 different campaigns that connected with each other, but they did not do the same thing as Resident Evil 2 in terms of allowing one scenario to affect the other. The greatest thing about having 2 scenarios that play differently based on decisions made in each scenario is the fact that it adds a lot more replayability to the game. For example, the original Resident Evil 2 motivated the players to play through the story 4 times total. That's because you would get unique cutscenes and interactions based on the 4 different combinations that you could play through the game. You have Leon A, Claire B, Claire A, and Leon B. This alone created a ton of replayability just for the entire story on its own. But for some reason, this is something that Capcom has failed to realize in future entries, and it's a dead and forgotten mechanic that I feel like above anything else on this list needs to come back at some point for a future Resident Evil game. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Should multiple scenarios, a dead and forgotten mechanic of Resident Evil be a feature that returns for a future Resident Evil game, or is there a different mechanic or feature that you'd rather see make it come back more? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.